First, I would like to mention MAYU Water. If you're trying to upgrade your hydration, MAYU uses a vortex flow system that mimics how water naturally moves in rivers and streams. That motion helps increase oxygenation and release unwanted gases like chlorine, improving overall water quality and making it easier to stay consistently hydrated. But here's what most people overlook. Hydration isn't just about water. It's about minerals and absorption. MAYU allows you to remineralize your water with essential minerals and electrolytes, supporting cellular hydration, energy levels, and overall physiological balance. When your water has the right structure and mineral content, your body can actually use it more efficiently. If you care about hydration, performance, or just feeling better day to day, this is one of those simple upgrades that adds up. You can get 10% off with the code AUTISM. Next, Daylight Computer Company and Daylight Kids. These devices are designed to work with your brain, not against it. And honestly, the future of tech is already here. Most screens are built for stimulation, bright, fast, and attention-grabbing. But that often leads to eye strain, mental fatigue, and disrupted sleep. Daylight takes a different approach. By reducing blue light and lowering overall sensory load, these devices support sustained focus, calmer attention, and healthier sleep patterns. For anyone who feels drained after screen time, or for kids whose nervous systems are still developing, this creates a much more natural, regulated way to engage with technology. If you want your tech to support your brain instead of overstimulating it, this is worth checking out. Use code AUTISM for $50 off. And finally, Chroma light devices, lights designed for humans. Natural light contains a full spectrum that our brains and bodies are tuned to. But most modern indoor lighting falls short of that. It's often narrow, harsh, and out of sync with how we're designed to experience light. Chroma is built to bring that balance back. These lights are designed to better reflect the qualities of natural light, supporting your circadian rhythm, reducing sensory strain, and creating environments that feel calmer and more aligned. That can translate into better sleep, more stable energy, and a nervous system that isn't constantly being pushed toward overload. If you have ever felt off under certain lighting and didn't know why, this is worth exploring. Get 10% off with the code AUTISM. If you're optimizing your environment, your focus, your well-being, your nervous system, these products are worth checking out. Across the last 4 episodes, there has been something built, kind of step by step. The first part, Autism and the Self, integrated some Carl Jung. Then the next episode had the self integrated with the crowd. We talked about Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, and Dostoevsky. Then part 3 was the mind itself, and how reality is constructed through perception, prediction, salience, filtering, and compression. And finally, the last episode, how shared reality becomes stabilized through collective agreement. For today's episode, we will talk about the system, why schools, workplaces, and society kind of break on differences. If different minds construct reality differently, and society stabilizes one dominant version of reality, then what happens when institutions are built on top of that dominant model? Think about this with the autistic phenotype. What happens when schools, workplaces, social systems, bureaucracies, and cultural expectations are all designed around one preferred style of processing? Because systems are not neutral, Every system assumes something about attention, communication, speed, motivation, emotion, social behavior, and what counts as so-called normal. Can you fit in or not? Are you like the so-called normal people or not? The reason we stick to the social norms is to make each other more predictable. Remember, we do not react to the world around us. We react to the predictions we have about the world around us. And step back. Thought is a component of planning. Planning is a component of executive functioning. Executive functioning is required to sustain. Thoughts are the foundation, and sustaining requires learning, memory, error correction, and change. When someone fits those assumptions, the system feels invisible. But when someone does not, the system suddenly becomes very visible. Not because it changed, but because it was never built with the individual's structure in mind. Part 4 showed us that shared reality itself is a compression project. Systems simply harden that compression into rules, metrics, and expectations. Schools compress learning and intelligence and behavior and attention into measurable categories. Workplaces compress productivity, communication, professionalism, and collaboration into standardized expectations. And social systems compress identity, emotion, interaction into predictable patterns that can be recognized quickly. Nietzsche's so-called immediate certainties. And this is not accidental. Systems need compression to scale. Without simplification, coordination slows, predictability weakens, and we hate that, and efficiency might collapse. So systems are designed around what works for the majority, so-called. Now, you can get lost in this. You can get lost, meaning yourself. You sacrifice yourself. For who? For what? And at what cost? Not necessarily what is most accurate, not necessarily what is deepest, but what is most stable for the system. Systems are not built to capture the full complexity of people. They are built to make large-scale coordination possible. And this creates the first tension, because the more a person's processing differs from the compressed model, the harder it becomes for the system to interpret them correctly. The larger a system becomes, the more simplification it requires to function. And sometimes misalignment looks like failure. One of the deepest problems is this: systems often confuse misalignment with deficiency. If a system expects rapid social signaling, compressed communication, faster transitions, and shared motivational patterns, then someone operating differently can appear disengaged, rigid, slow, overly intense, uncooperative, and emotionally distant. Not because they lack ability, but because the system is measuring compatibility with itself. This is one of the biggest hidden dynamics in education and social life. The metric often becomes, how easily can the person synchronize with the dominant structure? Right or wrong, it doesn't matter. Not how deeply can they think What patterns can they detect? What structures can they build? What realities can they perceive? And this is where autistic individuals often encounter chronic misunderstanding. Because many autistic traits are not failures of cognition. They are mismatches with system expectations around the compression, the salience, the pace, communication styles, and social prediction. What looks like dysfunction inside one system may be coherence inside another. And once a system labels a person through its own limitations, the person often begins interpreting themselves through those same limitations. I cannot overstate this enough. You have to be careful to what you attach your identity to. This is foundational psychological function here. This is the areas of growth and understanding the self. Systems often mistake compatibility for capability. So let's talk about the school systems. Schools are one of the clearest examples. Most educational systems reward rapid task switching, broad attention distribution, fast social adaptation, a compressed output, standardized demonstration of understanding. But many minds do not naturally operate that way. Some minds go deep instead of broad, retain detail instead of compressing it, focus intensely instead of shifting rapidly, require internal coherence before external performance. And that creates friction immediately. If you want to think about autism and think about how the change from one school teacher and spending time on various subjects into, let's say, a middle school, and you have multiple teachers and communication styles, and you're constantly subject switching every 40 to 50 minutes or so. And then through high school, you have to fit in. You have to do it. But that doesn't mean it's working. The issue is not intelligence. The issue is compatibility with the structure. A student who notices inconsistencies, questions assumptions, focuses intensely, and processes slowly but deeply can easily be interpreted as oppositional, distracted, inefficient, or socially disconnected. They can make it appear like they're not paying attention. Remember the problems, the so-called autistic phenotype in the classroom, the social communication phenomena, the sensory processing phenomena, the task switching. And even when the underlying cognition is highly sophisticated, and the deeper problem is this: the system often rewards behavioral synchronization over the perceptual accuracy. Schools often measure how efficiently a student fits the structure, not how deeply they understand reality. And once that happens repeatedly, many people begin internalizing the system's interpretation of them. And this is where the danger deepens, because eventually the person is no longer just adapting behavior. They begin questioning their own perception. This is in large part including and involving more than just the autistic phenotype. A system can make someone feel broken simply because their mind does not move at the system's preferred speed. The persona and survival. This is where Jung becomes extremely important again. Jung described the persona as the social interface, the version of the self adapted for the collective life. and every person develops one to some degree. But what happens when the gap between the internal structure and the demanded social structure becomes very large? That delta is a good indicator of problem. The persona stops being a flexible interface and it becomes survival architecture. Not necessarily false, but exhausting. The internal conflict here, because now the individual is continuously translating perception, emotion, attention, pacing, and communication into forms the system can recognize. And the more different the internal structure is, the more energy that translation requires. This is one reason many autistic individuals describe social environments not simply as difficult, but as cognitively draining. Because the task is merely interaction. It is a continuous real-time conversion between systems. The constant translation isn't just social, it's computational. The brain is forced to run two different predictive models in real time. The greater the mismatch between the self and the system, the more energy is spent translating it instead of developing it. And this creates another danger. Over time, adaptation can become so constant that the individual loses contact with their own structure beneath the surface, beneath the performance of the self. Which brings us directly back to Jung's warning in The Undiscovered Self. He said, the bigger the crowd, the more negligible the individual becomes. And perhaps this is hidden cost of excessive adaptation. The system becomes easy to navigate, while the self becomes harder to locate. You will lose yourself. The persona stops being a flexible interface. It becomes survival architecture. Jung himself described it as a complicated system of relations between individual consciousness and society. A mask that must constantly translate inner structure into something the collective can recognize. And the deeper this mismatch, the more the mask hardens into armor. And the real danger, he warned, is that we can no longer individuate. We can no longer reach the self, as long as we are still playing a role to ourselves. The more energy spent performing compatibility is the less energy remaining for becoming oneself. But why systems resist the change? Now we arrive at something even deeper. Why don't systems adapt more easily? Because systems optimize for stability, performance-driven, and if it's a school system, often determined by people outside of education, people with different agendas versus creating a true self, creating individualization, creating happiness. And stability depends on predictability. Difference introduces unpredictability. We hate that. Not because difference is inherently harmful, but because it complicates coordination. Every major institution, such as schools, workplaces, governments, and social norms, must simplify human complexity to function at scale. So we think. And once those simplifications stabilize, they begin protecting themselves. Nietzsche understood this deeply. The herd does not simply reject difference because it is wrong. It rejects difference because it destabilizes the structure the herd depends on. And once a system stabilizes around one style of processing, Anything outside of that style begins looking inefficient, disruptive, irrational, or even pathological. Systems rarely experience themselves as limited. They experience difference as the problem. Systems rarely experience themselves as limited, meaning the system doesn't think it's failing. The system doesn't think it's wrong. It makes the compression dynamic explicit. Nietzsche in The Gay Science says, morality is the herd instinct in the individual. And Nietzsche saw this mechanism clearly. Morality is the herd instinct in the individual. Systems do not merely enforce behavior, they internalize the herd's need for compression so completely that in any mind that retains more detail, more precision, or more bottom-up perception is automatically branded immoral, inefficient, or pathological. The herd does not debate truth. It enforces the simplification that keeps the herd stable. Can you fit in or not? Are you like the so-called normal people or not? Who is on this white horse, looking down at others, judging others, and saying, you're different, you're not right, you must change, or else? And this creates one of the great paradoxes of human progress. Many of the people who move systems forward are initially interpreted as incompatible with them. Nietzsche wrote, "No price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself." And systems often make that price very high. The system protects stability first, even when stability comes at the cost of truth. And Kierkegaard had already named the deeper mechanism decades earlier. The crowd is untruth. Systems do not simply resist difference, they level it. They perform what he called the leveling process, reducing every unique structure of mind to the same flat, measurable plane so that coordination can continue without friction. The single individual who refuses that leveling becomes invisible or incomprehensible to the system, not because they are wrong, but because the system's very stability depends on the crowd remaining the crowd. So how about this cost of chronic misalignment? What happens when someone spends years inside of a system that constantly misreads them? Often, exhaustion, fragmentation, chronic self-monitoring, identity confusion, learned suppression of perception, disconnection from internal coherence. You look at society today. You look at how many of those key details apply all around society. Because eventually the pressure is not just external, it becomes internalized. The person begins asking, why am I different? Why can't I do this naturally? What is the matter with me? I can't. Why does reality seem harder for me than everyone else? But the deeper question may actually be, what happens when a structurally different mind is forced to continuously adapt to a system that cannot accurately perceive it? That question changes everything, because now the issue is no longer weakness or laziness or failure. It becomes chronic structural mismatch. And prolonged mismatch changes people. Not only behaviorally, but neurological, emotional, and existential. Dostoevsky explored the psychological cost relentlessly. Again and again, his characters struggle, not because they are incapable of thought, but because they are incapable of reducing themselves enough to comfortably fit the structures around them. In Notes from the Underground Man says, "I swear to you, gentlemen, that to be overly conscious is a sickness, a real, thorough sickness. Shower upon him every earthly blessing, and even then every man, out of sheer ingratitude, sheer libel, would pay you some loathsome trick, simply in order to prove to himself that men still are men and not piano keys. Not because awareness itself is pathology, but because hyper-awareness becomes painful inside systems built on simplification. Return to your box and get on your rat wheel. The more contradiction, artificiality, and compression someone perceives around them, the harder it becomes to move effortlessly through ordinary social reality. The deeper this mismatch between a person and the system around them, the more exhausting ordinary life becomes. Dostoevsky's Underground Man does not suffer merely because he is overly conscious. He suffers because he is forced to live inside structures that treat him as a piano key, a predictable unit in a perfectly compressed system. And his deepest rebellion is a refusal to accept that compression, even when it promises comfort. The mind that sees too clearly will choose the pain of contradiction over the comfort of the lie. And perhaps this is one of Dostoevsky's deepest insights. Human beings suffer not only from pain, but from being forced to exist inside structures that deny the full complexity of their inner world. The more someone perceives contradiction inside the system, the harder it becomes to live inside it unconsciously. So what actually helps? Not eliminating all structure, not eliminating all adaptation, but creating environments where the gap between the person and the system decreases. The persona can remain a flexible interface instead of hardening into survival armor. And the deeper self is given room to breathe. Because development requires energy. And the more energy spent translating perception, emotion, attention, and pacing into forms the system can recognize, the less remains for creativity, learning, exploration, insight, and authentic growth. Jung called this process individuation, the lifelong task of divesting the self of the false wrappings of the persona so that the deeper self can emerge. When the right environment reduces unnecessary translation cost, it does not remove challenge. It frees the energy that individuation requires. The individual is no longer forced to choose between authenticity and survival. This is why the right environment matters so much. Not because it removes difficulty, but because it stops forcing the mind to run two operating systems at once. And this is where society still struggles. And it always will. And it always has. Many systems still assume one communication style, one pacing style, one attentional structure, one acceptable social rhythm. But human minds are more varied than the system built around them. The goal is not to force every mind into the same structure. The goal is to build structures capable of tolerating more than one kind of mind, so that individuation, not merely adaptation, becomes possible. And perhaps the future of healthy systems is reducing the need for uniform, but greater tolerance for cognitive diversity. The healthiest systems are not the ones that eliminate difference. They are the ones strong enough to include it, and strong enough to let the self, rather than the persona, lead. Across these episodes, we've built a progression here. The self has structure. The crowd stabilizes shared reality. The mind constructs experience through processing. And shared reality becomes social illusion. And systems are built on top of that illusion. So the tension many people experience is not random. It emerges from the collision between internal structure and institutional structure. And once you see that, many things begin to make sense. Not everything that struggles inside a system is broken. Sometimes, the system simply does not know how to perceive what stands in front of it. And perhaps this is the deeper challenge facing modern society. Not simply learning how to tolerate differences, but learning how to recognize forms of intelligence, perception, and inner structure that existing systems were never designed to understand. A system can only recognize the kinds of minds it was built to understand. If you're listening to the podcast, listening to the episode, please feel free to leave a review or rating. In podcasting, reviews, ratings, and downloads are huge, and I very much appreciate your feedback. You can contact me on X at RPS47586. You can email me info.fromthespectrum@gmail.com. You can check out the YouTube page for full-length videos, shorts, and clips. Thank you for listening to From the Spectrum podcast.